You know what's strange? Everyone has an opinion about millennials. Lazy, entitled, killed the napkin industry. But here's what nobody talks about. The psychology of Generation Y is probably the most contradictory of any living generation. And it's not because they're broken. It's because they were caught in a transition the human brain had never experienced before. Born roughly between 1981 and 1996, millennials are the only generation that will ever remember both worlds, the before and the after. They're your coworkers who can't afford houses their parents bought at 25, your friends who overshare their feelings but undersell their accomplishments, the people who were told they could be anything, then graduated into an economy that told them they'd be lucky to be employed. And here's the thing, their psychology isn't just different, it's what happens when an entire generation gets psychologically whiplashed. They grew up being told they were special, then spent their 20s being told they were the problem. That contradiction shows up in everything they do. Picture this. It's 1995. You're 8 years old, and your teacher looks you in the eye and says, "You can be anything you want to be. You're special." This wasn't just one teacher. This was the entire parenting philosophy of the 1990s. According to research published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, millennials grew up during an unprecedented shift. Parents who were neglected as latchkey kids became hyper-present, hovering. You got participation trophies, not because you asked for them. Your parents gave them to you to build your self-esteem. The irony? You knew they were meaningless. You could tell the difference between actually winning and just showing up. But the message sank in anyway. You're special just for existing. Psychologist Jean Twenge found that millennials scored significantly higher on self-esteem than any previous generation, but also higher on anxiety and depression, because high self-esteem without achievement creates cognitive dissonance. You believe you're meant for great things, but reality keeps telling you otherwise. Then you graduate. It's 2008, maybe 2009. The economy collapses. Companies want 3 to 5 years of experience for entry-level positions that pay less than your parents made in the 1980s, adjusted for inflation. All that "you're special" messaging crashes into a wall of "you're replaceable." According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, millennials who graduated between 2007 and 2012 faced unemployment rates double that of previous generations. And economists found something devastating. Getting your first job during a recession impacts your earning potential for 15 to 20 years. This created a specific psychological pattern, defensive optimism mixed with financial pessimism. Millennials will tell you they're going to change the world. They genuinely believe it. But they also don't believe they'll ever retire. Both things are true in their heads simultaneously. Here's what people get wrong. Millennials aren't digital natives. That's Gen Z. Millennials are digital immigrants who arrived young enough to learn the language fluently, but old enough to remember the before times. You're 12 years old. You come home and wait until someone gets off the phone before you can use the internet. You sit there listening to that dial-up screech for 45 seconds while a single web page loads. You learn patience because you have no choice. But then it changes. Suddenly, broadband, Wi-Fi, a smartphone in your pocket with more power than NASA used to land on the moon. Your brain adapted. But adaptation isn't the same as nativity. Millennials remember crafting the perfect aim-away message. Not to build a personal brand. They didn't know what that was yet. They were trying to seem cool to their crush who might log on after dinner. They remember the specific anxiety of hearing the door creak sound when someone signed on. Would it be the person you wanted? This created something unique. A generation that understands both analog patience and digital speed. They can handle delayed gratification because they grew up waiting. But they're also wired for instant responses because they've spent half their lives where everything is immediate. And social media. Millennials didn't just adopt it. They built their identities with it during the exact developmental stage when identity formation happens. MySpace taught them to curate. Facebook taught them to perform. Instagram taught them to package their lives into aesthetic squares. The result? A generation hyper-aware of how they're perceived, but exhausted by the performance. They overshare because that's what the algorithm rewards, but they resent the pressure to be on all the time. Let's talk about what actually shaped millennial psychology more than anything else. Economic betrayal. You did everything right. You went to college because that's what you were told to do. You picked something you loved because they said it didn't matter what you studied. You graduated with honors. And then you couldn't find a job that paid enough to cover rent, let alone student loans. According to the National Financial Capability Study, millennials carry an average student loan debt of over $40,000. One woman interviewed by CNBC had $54,000 in debt. After years of payments, she'd only reduced it to $49,000. She works part-time, making $15 an hour with a college degree. Her quote, "I feel like I'm smarter and better than where I am right now." That's millennial psychology in one sentence. The belief that you're capable of more, trapped in circumstances that won't let you prove it. This created what psychologists call learned helplessness, mixed with compulsive striving. Millennials work harder than previous generations. Side hustles, freelancing, constant hustle. Not because they're entrepreneurial by nature, but because they learned one income stream isn't enough. It can disappear. But no matter how hard they work, the goalposts keep moving. Homeownership? Their parents bought houses in their 20s. Millennials are in their 40s still renting. Starting a family? Delayed because they can't afford childcare. Retirement? Over half say they don't believe it's possible. This isn't pessimism, it's pattern recognition. The economy has crashed on them twice. Once in 2008 when they were starting careers, again in 2020 when they were trying to build stability. They've learned that no matter how responsible they are, external forces will disrupt their progress. Psychologically, this manifests as hypervigilance about money combined with guilt about spending. Millennials will research a purchase for weeks, read 17 reviews, then feel guilty after buying it even though they needed it. Because scarcity is their baseline, even when they have enough. Here's something millennials did that previous generations didn't. They normalized talking about mental health. Therapy isn't shameful, it's self-care. Anxiety isn't weakness, it's a legitimate medical condition. Depression isn't something you just push through, it's something you treat. According to Deloitte's survey, 41% of millennials reported feeling stressed or anxious most or all of the time. And critically, 49% who took time off work for mental health lied about it to their employers. Why? Because even though they're open about mental health in their personal lives, they know it's still stigmatized professionally. They've learned to code switch, to perform wellness at work while falling apart at home. But this openness came at a cost. Being the first generation to talk openly about mental health meant being the first to be mocked for it. Millennials are snowflakes. They can't handle anything. What actually happened? They grew up during Columbine. They watched 9/11 on live television during formative years. They experienced economic collapse twice. They lived through a pandemic that stole years of their lives. They're not fragile, they're exhausted. And unlike previous generations who suffered in silence, they're naming it. That's not weakness, that's evolution. Here's what makes millennial psychology so complex. They're a bridge between two worlds that hate each other. They remember childhood without the internet, building forts, coming home when streetlights came on, boredom that lasted for hours. But they also lived through the digital revolution. They built online identities. They learned to curate. They adapted to every platform. This makes them translators. At work, they explain technology to older colleagues and analog processes to younger ones. At family dinners, they mediate between boomer parents who don't understand why they're struggling and Gen Z siblings who can't imagine life before smartphones. It's exhausting. Being a bridge means never fully belonging to either side. Criticized by older generations for being entitled and mocked by younger generations for being old. But here's what nobody talks about. Bridges hold things together. Millennials inherited a broken economic system and a dying planet. They didn't create these problems, but they're the ones trying to fix them. They're raising the next generation differently. More presence, less pressure. They're fighting for climate change because they know their kids will inherit whatever they leave behind. They're pushing for systemic change because they experienced how badly those systems failed them. Here's the truth about Generation Y. They're not entitled. They're disillusioned, but still trying. They're not lazy. They're working multiple jobs and still not making enough. They're not fragile. They're the first generation brave enough to admit when they're struggling. They were promised the world and handed a dumpster fire. They were told to dream big and then punished for having student debt. They were raised to believe hard work pays off and then learned that the system was rigged before they even entered it. But they didn't give up. They adapted. They hustled. They created careers out of nothing because traditional employment wouldn't have them. They're rewriting the rules on relationships, on work, on success, because the old rules didn't work. Millennials value experiences over possessions because they learned that possessions can be repossessed. They prioritize flexibility over stability because stability was never real. They demand work-life balance because they watched their parents sacrifice everything for companies that didn't care. This is the psychology of Generation Y. Contradictory, complex, caught between worlds, but resilient in ways previous generations never had to be. They're not better than other generations. They're different, shaped by economic trauma, technological whiplash, and broken promises. And they're still here, still trying, still believing that maybe they can build something better for the generation coming after them. Because that's what bridges do. They hold things together long enough for the next group to cross. If this resonated with you, if you saw yourself in this, you're not alone. This channel explores the psychology behind the patterns nobody else talks about. Subscribe to join a community that gets it. And if any of this hit home, drop a comment. Your story matters.